and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change ripple through economies and industries. And addressing these challenges requires not only robust government policies, but also strong corporate leadership. Now, our corporate boards are equipped to lead in this front. They hold immense power over how companies respond to the climate crisis. So to discuss this further, I have on the show with me Datin Seri Sunita Rajakumar, who is the Chairperson of Climate Governance Malaysia, which is an advocacy group working to mobilise corporate boards to accelerate the transition to net zero and to build climate resilience. Climate Governance Malaysia is the country chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative. It is the first such country chapter to be established in Asia Pacific, and it is the second such in the world. So, Datin Seri Sunita, thank you for being on the show with me. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me here.
I want to set the stage a little bit and get people familiar with Climate Governance Malaysia. What exactly was it set up to do? What was the vision in establishing this country chapter? What does it aim to do?
So as you pointed out, it is the board of directors which directs the company. And companies all around the world are responsible for emissions. Emissions are leading to global warming. And so the boardroom needs to be aware of climate risks, physical and transition risks, and how the boardroom also can potentially be liable for not managing these risks. So this is what Climate Governance Malaysia do. We do a lot of advocacy work to the boardroom, but now we have over 6,500 subscribers to our newsletters, 50% open rate for every newsletter that goes out, and we've started advocacy work with policymakers and regulators as well. And I'm delighted, and I'm sure we're going to unpack this later, but I'm delighted to have the support of so many ministries and the regulators, the Central Bank, the Securities Commission and the Stock Exchange for this really, really important existential crisis.
Okay. Well, what's your diagnosis, your assessment of I would say industry readiness in a way, when you look at corporate boards across the country? What's your assessment? How ready are they? And I understand that maybe sectors vary in terms of readiness.
So I think what we're seeing is the largest mobilization of the private sector between Climate Governance Malaysia and the CEO Action Network, which has over 70 CEOs agitating for increased climate and sustainability ambition. And it is for the climate crisis. And so it's really rewarding to be in this space, to be speaking to so many business leaders who are agitating, who are willing to support this. But we are moving very quickly because business leaders also see this as a competitive edge. Malaysia is a small, open trading economy. So many of our trading partners, multinationals, because we punch well above our weight. I think we're number 9 in the global supply chain for semiconductors. So all of our trading partners are insisting that we align with their sustainability ambitions. So many of the businesses are already aligned with that, and now we're trying to get policy to catch up.
Yeah, so private sector often leads in this respect,
in
right?
this case, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when we think about the role of boards, corporate boards, boards of directors, in pushing for the climate agenda within their organizations, what does that look like? How do you integrate climate awareness into operations of, it could be, you know, a multinational corporation down to a smaller listed company?
Right. So World Economic Forum issued in January 2019 Climate Governance Principles. So it starts off with recognition that the Board of Directors is accountable as stewards of the organization for climate risks. Put another way, it is so mainstream right now that really understanding the basics of climate science is something that your children, grandchildren will be talking about. So the boardroom basically has no defense in saying that they didn't understand, they didn't know, they didn't think, they didn't realize, and so on and so forth. And then the other principles then follow, that you have to ensure that the board committees, that you have sufficient climate literacy on boards, that the incentives are aligned, and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is reporting and disclosure. And I'm delighted that the new chairman of the Securities Commission really pushed through sustainability reporting, which is going to start next year with the larger companies. And that's also been a real vote of confidence that private sector in Malaysia can step up, can meet the needs, and of course this has been lauded by the Institutional Investors Council, Minority Shareholders Watch Group, the stock exchange is supporting this. The central bank has for many years now worked through what they call the Joint Committee on Climate Change to get banks and insurers to be better aligned, because this is a systemic risk on the financial system as well.
Can we focus, I would love to talk about the reporting disclosure a little bit, but I want to focus or hone in on climate literacy amongst board members. I'm sure the situation now is much better than it was before, but what does it mean for the board to be climate literate? How much information does a board member need for them to be able to be accountable for the company's sustainability practices?
That is such a good question. There's no straightforward answer to this. I think as a base, all directors need to have read the mitigation memo, that you need to be on top of your carbon footprint, not just direct, purchased, and up and down your value chain as well. You need to know what it is, because unless you can measure it, you're definitely not going to be able to manage it, right? But increasingly, the carbon COP is converging with the biodiversity COP as well. And so there's this alignment, and this is particularly relevant for Malaysia because currently we contribute 0.7% of global emissions. Historically, we've contributed only 0.4%. So we are a really tiny contributor to this massive global problem. However, there are only 17 countries in the world of mega biodiversity, and we are one of them. We have a long marine coastline, and so we also have marine biodiversity. And that is a massive responsibility for us. So if you are having businesses which are profiteering from the destruction of the environment and treating nature as a giant sewer, whether it's emissions or chemicals, then what society is saying is that you need to be accountable. And the best way for us to price this negative externality is by imposing carbon pricing. So that the people, the businesses who are emitting, for example, need to pay for the emissions, which, and ideally that source of income to the government will be used to increase our resilience.
I didn't know that about us being one of the mega biodiverse countries. That's very encouraging to know.
Absolutely.
But that is a responsibility that we need to protect and put as one of our top agendas.
So we are a steward of the environment.
And corporate board directors are stewards of the company. So talk to me about how there can sometimes be a disconnect between what is needed from a board of director versus the sustainability pledges that a company makes. So the people who understand the implications of climate change may not know or have business experience typically, and the people who have the business experience are the company veterans or industry veterans who are board members and may not know much about climate change. How do you balance that cycle? It is a vicious cycle, and how do you break out of it?
So this is something relatively new. I mean, Climate Governance Malaysia was launched in May 2019. At that time, I hardly had anyone to talk to. I was really, and thankfully, or not thankfully, but one of the unintended consequences is that when we entered the pandemic and we were all sitting at home, it was easier for me to run webinars and to actually speak to people from Europe and UK and learn more about what are the issues, what are the challenges. Because obviously, despite the entire world agreeing in Paris in December 2015, somehow 10 years later we've not been able to make much progress, and we're grossly behind in a lot of the timelines that we were hoping to embed. So I think this issue of lack of climate literacy, lack of real understanding, the way I describe it sometimes is that you have a spectrum. You've got some businesses that consider this to be a reporting and disclosure problem. So they might be very enthusiastic, they might be really coming from the CSR angle, we want to plant trees, and they want to win awards for their sustainability reporting. Now the problem is you can't make this reporting into your transition pathway. And so at the other end of the spectrum are businesses which are embedding sustainability into the DNA of their business. So the very design of a product, where they are sourcing the raw materials from, what the product can be used for, what happens to the product after its use, can it be returned to the business, can it be recycled, upcycled, can it be reused, and so on and so forth.
So how do you get from the kind of disclosure and
from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum?
How do you get that mindset shift, the paradigm shift?
Absolutely. So obviously there's so many voices that you can reach out to. We're moving away from shareholder capitalism to a stakeholder economy. So you can reach out to NGOs, CSOs. Your staff might have really, really good ideas, especially the younger generation. It might be the CEO that's personally championing this. And I gave the example of the CEO Action Network earlier. And of course, the boardroom has an outsized responsibility. The board directs the company.
Right.
And the board can actually set targets, for example, net zero by 2030 or halving by 2030.
When we think about the responsibility of the board, do you think we need a dedicated climate expert on the board? Or should all board members have this collective individual knowledge that they bring as a certain baseline knowledge? Or do you need one dedicated person? What do you think?
So I think historically, for example, there would be one person on the board who was financially literate, right? And that person would be on the audit committee, and anytime the accounts came up, everybody turned to that person and said, what do you think? Is it okay? Can we go? But now, almost every member of the board is expected to be financially literate. Right. You need to be able to read the report and understand and ask intelligent questions. Of course, it's delegated to the audit committee, but all board members are expected to have some level of proficiency. I think the climate crisis is going to be like that. It is such an existential crisis that's really going to have your business on its knees. You might think your asset, a substation or even this broadcast station, for example, is clear from extreme weather events, but if the roads are impassable, your staff can't come into work, we have no food security, if there's hyperinflation or medical supplies, your business is going to be on its knees. And so every single director needs to be relatively climate literate, and there's so many different aspects of it. It's about mitigation, measuring, managing, reducing the levels of carbon emission and how you're going to report this. There's adaptation, how you're going to ensure that your business is resilient. There's adaptation of your ecosystem, because you can't have a business that's resilient unless your ecosystem is resilient.
Also resilient, yeah.
Exactly. So there's so many different aspects of it. And I really feel that every single member of the board needs to have a passing familiarity with these issues.
How long was it before you became not the only climate expert on boards? I can imagine in the early days, people turned to you to be you're the one dedicated climate expert, and now hopefully boards have leveled up in terms of their climate literacy.
I'm really fortunate because I'm sitting on the board of 5 multinationals. And I think in almost every board, I'm with a really bright room, a room of bright, intelligent people. And so most of them, by far, really understand the issues, understand why, as DG Jessica said 2 days ago at an event, she said whenever there's a crisis, one of the first questions that comes up is, what was the board doing? And so that's why directors need to pick their boards really carefully, because you want to be surrounded by peers who are smart, intelligent, and understand what's going on.
To that shift in the spectrum, right, from one end of seeing it as an obligation of reporting and disclosure versus a mindset where sustainability is really embedded. And I think that comes with a shift in the viewpoint that there is opportunity in a low carbon economy. There's opportunity in this transition. How do you communicate that or embed that kind of thinking into your board? Because if we're thinking about this from a negative perspective and the risks and the threats, we're never going to break out and see what this means for our economy.
Absolutely. So not only is Malaysia a net exporting country, but this region, this part of the world with a very young demographic has tremendous potential. We might be addicted to fossil fuels and we have relatively young coal power plants, but there's tremendous potential. And you know what, Melissa, there are so many businesses that are looking at this as a massive opportunity to provide the foundations of the transition economy and their opportunity to create value. And this is a competitive edge. So they're running ahead, they're creating value, they're unlocking transition finance while competitors are like, you know, is this a fad? Is this a real thing?
But
you
there's also a lot of hesitance around what transition assets entail and whether we should put more money. Sometimes there is also the question of returns and high costs involved. You mentioned a bit earlier that private sector or industry seems to be leading the way, really gung-ho because of they see the opportunities. And government being the behemoth that it is, may be slight laggard. How do you view Malaysia's political will or trajectory in terms of climate policies?
Working with Minister Nick Nazmi, YB Nick Nazmi, has been an unmitigated pleasure. He's smart, he listens carefully, he's articulate, so you can explain a problem to him, he immediately grasps it, he asks intelligent questions, he takes it on board and he runs with it. You know, so it's a pleasure. But is the ministry under-resourced, understaffed? Absolutely. And this is where private sector tries to help. So they recently closed a consultation on the climate change bill, and I think many of us came up with our suggestions. And the great thing is they are open, they are listening, and it's not just NRES, Ministry of Finance. At the summit in September, we had the honor of hosting Datuk Johan American, and again he was so articulate, he was on top of the issues. Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Trade.
You to give me an example of what are some of the feedback that you're hearing from private sector that you would like to communicate to the government? Yes.
Okay. So I think, listen, I think many in the private sector understand the gravity of the situation. And there's only so much that private sector can do on their own. If government can step up and support, for example, by removing subsidies for fossil fuel, by pricing carbon, by providing incentives for technologies which are needed, by unlocking more climate finance or transition finance which is needed. And my favorite bugbear is democratizing access to data so that everyone, including you and I, can make informed decisions about our assets and our savings.
Why is that?
Why is that difficult?
Yeah, why is that?
Yeah.
Why is that something you're really championing?
I think agencies, ministries are starting to realize that holding data sets close to their chest only increases their vulnerability and their liability. Because when there are problems, if there's flash flooding, landslides, sinkholes, and you didn't provide any early warning, you went on with development approvals, for example, then chances are you are going to be liable in some form or another, right? At the least, you're going to be liable for the remedial works and for the cost of rehabilitation. But at some stage, there's going to be litigation because we're seeing this all around the world, that you're simply not doing enough to protect us from the worst effects of a warming world.
You think it could go to litigation?
It's already happening all around the world.
Oh, tell me.
Yeah. So, for example, in certain countries, there's lawsuits against carbon majors. There's a landmark Philippines human rights case where a group of NGOs are suing the top 30 carbon majors, oil and gas companies in the world, saying that you have contributed to 30% of emissions, and the science, the causality is so clear that your emissions have caused a warming world, which is causing adverse weather events, which is causing more typhoons, which is destroying property, and we're losing lives because of that. Therefore, you need to pay for 30% of the bill. So there's so many lawsuits all around the world now, and the latest, of course, with the Indian Supreme Court, because their constitution most closely, our constitution most closely reflects theirs, is, and also hot on the heels of the United Nations resolution that everyone, anywhere, has a right to a safe, healthy, sustainable environment.
Wow.
So we have a right to that.
There is, I feel the urgency of climate action, and I feel it from you, your passion comes across. When you look, if we were to zoom out outside of Malaysia, and COP29 is happening in Baku, Azerbaijan, there's a little bit of pessimism, if I may use that word, given the re-election of Donald Trump and the US maybe pulling out of the Paris Agreement. What are your views? I know climate action is a long game, but every small step counts. Everyone's collective action matters. So when you think about the US being one of the largest polluters, historical polluters, the largest historical polluter, and not being part of this UN process, is that a setback for progress? How do you view it?
So it's what we call tragedy of the horizons. This is a phrase coined by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, where he said this appears to be that tsunami on the horizon, like really far away, but the problem is if you don't do anything now, this problem is only going to be exacerbated. And as a matter of fact, we're warming faster than a lot of the climate modeling has showed. Earlier, we would think that you need to get to net zero by 2050 to limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees by the end of the century. We're already at 1.5 degrees today.
Right.
Now, this is a short-term, 1 month, 1 year basis, whereas scientists tend to look at a 20 or 30-year horizon. But that gravity of the situation is not lost on anyone, even those who claim to be climate deniers. Now, have we looked to the US for climate ambition? Not really. I think in the past it's been the EU, UK that have really demonstrated thought leadership. Has there been a pause as many of our trading partners are re-looking sustainability ambition to make sure that it doesn't give them a competitive disadvantage, that they want to go so far ahead that, and it's expensive, that they are disadvantaged? Yeah, there are people looking at it. But is it inexorable? The amount of solar that's being installed on a daily basis is 2 gigawatts around the world. Is it possible that China has already peaked emissions and that from now onwards they're going to be on their trajectory to halving emissions? So these are things which a lot of intelligent people are looking at, and like we keep going back to, this is a competitive advantage. So of course you could be constantly looking over your shoulder, what is everybody doing? But I can assure you, Melissa, there are many business leaders who are just looking ahead at true north, wanting to do what's right by all of us.
If you were to look ahead, true north, say 5 years, I mean, we want to not focus too far in the horizon and look at the tsunami, but closer to shore, where do you see our transition to a low carbon economy? What gives you, Climate Governance Malaysia hope that the corporate sector will be successful in this transition, in an orderly transition, I might add?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's only so much that the corporate sector can do. And many of them are already doing what they can. And they're determined. Head office has given them marching orders, or investors have told them, and they're doing whatever they can do. And a lot of them are lobbying with the government for the tax incentives, for the grants, etc., that they need to level the playing field. Because for so long, we've been addicted to subsidized fossil fuel, and it's very hard to compete with that, right? What I would really hope for is that the government, and especially as chair of ASEAN, has the confidence to be able to demonstrate thought leadership. That we can actually stick our necks out, and instead of some sort of neo-colonial, or what is the West doing, why aren't they, and we have to wait for ... for us to actually come up and be thought leaders. Half the world's population is in this area. This part of the world is the factory for the world. This is a young part of the world. Things are so dynamic, the energy levels are off the charts. I think we're ready to demonstrate thought leadership as to what is the right thing to do, and for us to do it cheaper, faster, better, and sustainably.
It's been so enlightening talking to you. Thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Melissa.
That's all we have for you. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.